We continue with the countries south of the border, and our next speaker is our own economist who is in charge of Latin America, Patricia Krause from Coface, Brazil. She will talk about Latin America, who wins and loses from Trumponomics. Patricia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today. As Kirsten mentioned, I'm the economist for Latin America, and I'm Brazilian based in São Paulo. And so now we are going a little bit to the south, to the Latin American economies. But I would like to start in a different way. We were going to first make the polls, 3 questions, and then I will give the answers through the presentation, okay? So the first question. In 2017, activity in Latin America is expected to report the 3rd year in a row of recession, remain stable, report a mild rebound, or report a strong recovery. Okay, that seems. Good. Seems that people are more optimistic about the near future. Yeah, that's good. So, okay, now we can go to I think you can go to the second question. How have the Latin American currencies been reperforming this year? Strongly depreciating, slightly depreciating, generally appreciating, or strongly depreciating? I changed the order.
It's kind of the same.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that majority thinks that's slightly depreciating for the major currencies in Latin America. Generally stable, yeah, with slightly depreciating. Okay. So the third question, last one. So how much does the Mexico export to the U.S. represent? 10% of the Mexico's GDP, 15%, 25%, or 30% of GDP? Okay, so it seems that everybody thinks that the US export to the U.S. has a really high weight to Mexico's GDP. Yeah, so we're going to see the answers in the presentation. We can change the presentation now and start it. Okay. So, it's here with me. Okay, so the current environment for the Latin American economy. So for this year, we're expecting a slight recovery of GDP after 2 years in a row of recession. Okay, this movement should mainly be led by Brazil and Argentina, especially a stronger recovery in Argentina, though the recovery that we're expecting for the Brazilian economy is only of 0.4%, and it's important to remind that the economy contracted by 7.4% in only 2 years, the biggest recession in its history. So they are actually celebrating this 0.4% of increase. And as the Brazilian economy still has a strong representativeness to the region's GDP, around roughly 40% of the GDP, that's why we expect this rebound in activity in the region, basically the main reasons. Though, of course, one of the main points now is about the Mexican economy. There was a strong fears about the future of the economy as Trump started to increase in the polls, to increase the chances. And as he was elected, this was seen in the movement of the exchange rate. But since the mid-January this year, we have seen some slowdown in the risk in terms of exchange rates. Also, his tweeters has been reducing the rhetoric, not so much threats against the Mexican economy. Okay. On the other hand, we see some downside risk for Chile, for Peru, and for Colombia. Peru is still leading the activity in the region. It increased by 3.9% the last year. We were expecting to increase by further 4% this year, though they are facing a strong El Niño phenomenon, that's in the Pacific coast. Right now, impacted their agriculture activity in the north side of Peru and actually also in Lima. So they have reviewed their GDP growth forecast. Also, this has also an impact of the infrastructure project, which are also in delay because of corruption scandals which started in Brazil, but then they saw that this was widespread through the region, and so the new president there was a pro-business guy, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, decided to say this company to leave the country because they could not accept to have such kind of company there. But on the other hand, we see some delays in an infrastructure project which will impact activity this year. We have also Colombia, not only because of oil prices, we see some better prices than it was in 1 year before, though we know that's not going to strongly bounce in the near future. So they are highly reliant. They see also their employment markets impacted, and so consumption as well. And in Chile, the risks associated with a long-lasting mining strike there. They also hold presidential elections, and things can change. They are discussing social security, and this discussion is something that's never popular, and no one wants to change their benefits. So we see also downside risk. Though we can say that the external environment so far this year has been more stable, more positive than in the same period of the previous year. We see the commodity prices, we are more relatively higher than the previous year. We see GDP growth, global GDP growth that is also better than it was before. So this is something positive for the Latin American economies, for emerging economies. We see that the exchange rates are generally appreciating this year, slightly appreciating after 2 years of strong depreciation because of commodity prices. And also space to reduce interest rates in some countries, even with the idea that the Federal Reserve will continue increasing interest rates in the US. Of course, also because they are expecting this movement to be gradual, we are expecting only 2 hikes this year of 0.25. So we see that in some economies there, as inflation is controlled, there is still space to reduce interest rates, and Brazil is the main case. So here we look for the 4 main commodities for the region. We have copper prices, iron ore, oil prices, and soybean. Copper is extremely important for the Peruvian and the Chilean economy, iron ore for the Brazilian economy, oil for many economies. Of course, the most notorious case is the case of Venezuela, but also for Ecuador, for Mexico, for Brazil. And bless you, and soybean for Argentina and for Brazil. Also, they are also main producers as the US. So when we consider the level of prices in early 2013 and the level nowadays, they are still below the level that it was before. As we see, the slump in oil prices was in the mid of 2014 and the other commodities as well. Though their weakest point was achieved in early that previous year, roughly around January last year, and now they have been more stable and in a better shape in the last months. Also, in terms of the road activity, as I mentioned, we are expecting some a better GDP, global activity for this year. So Coface forecast GDP growth for the global economy is of 2.8 for this year, after 2.5 from the last year. And then when we break down through the countries, the regions are main contributors, we still expect China to be the main contributor to growth. China should contribute with 1 percentage point to the global activity this year. It should be followed by other emerging economies, with 0.9. then the US 0.4, and the European zone with 0.3, and finally other advanced economies. So even with all the discussion that emerging economies not increasing in the same rhythm that they were before, they are still the main contributor to the euro activity. And the second chart shows how business confidence has been improving. This is not only in the US, it is in other major markets as well, developed and underdeveloped emerging ones. We see the case of Brazil, for instance, that is still weak, but it has also been rebounding in the last year. So with this more positive scenario, relatively more positive scenario, we see there is lower risk, generally lower risk for these economies. So here we, as a proxy for the risk of these main economies in Latin America, we consider the 5-year CDS, the credit default swap, which is like a hedge for the non-payment risk, the full risk of sovereign or corporate companies. So it's important to have in mind, it's worth noting that the green line, which is for Argentina, is in the right axis because it's in another level of risk. Yeah, so we see this breakdown, this strong increase in the level of risk in Argentina in mid of 2014. This is basically because of the default with the holdout when the U.S. court decided that they need to pay the holdout, the bondholders from the debt of 2002. So at that time they were with a populist government of Cristina Kirchner, and they didn't pay it. They tried to postpone this, and after the Mauricio Macri, the current president, more pro-business guy, took office in end 2015, few months after they solved this case. That's why we see the risk going down, and now it's more stable at a lower level. In Brazil, which is the blue line, we also saw a strong increase in 2015. This was associated with the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. At that time, there was a strong volatility in the market. No one knew what was going to happen, though the market received with good eyes her impeachment, and then the risk started to go down as well. And finally, it's important to mention the case of Mexico. It's also increased in the previous year because of the strong volatility, and as well as the currency started to go down again since the mid of January this year. This movement was also seen in the exchange rates of the major currencies. Again, in Argentina, we also have another break in series, as they used to have an overvaluated exchange rate, an artificial. They had a black market, so two extremely different exchange rates, and there you also see that generally the exchange rates now have been appreciating this year after the strong depreciation. In Mexico, nowadays, after depreciating by 19% the last year, nowadays, year to date, it's appreciated by 10% because of the lowest risk associated with what Trump could do. Yeah, also because their central bank has been acting in the markets. They created a program that could sell up to 20 billion US dollars for investors. So in terms of GDP growth, here are our last forecast. We review this on a quarterly basis. So in Argentina, as I mentioned, after a decrease of 2.3 in the last year, we're expecting the economy to increase by 2%. Actually, as we expect inflation to start to decrease and to see some improvement in the purchase power of the families. Yeah. In Brazil, 0.4 increase. This is mainly associated with a record crop, which is expected for Brazil this year, with 22% of increase, and also a good export side. Yeah. And Chile is still below 2%. We're expecting 1.8, but we might review this downward in the next months. In Colombia, also similar to the growth observed in the previous year, around 2.3. In Ecuador, after a recession, we're expecting a slight recovery of 0.3% for this year. They actually had elections in the last month, there was a big confusion about elections. Rafael Correa's president, his candidate, the left-wing candidate, he won election, but there was some fraud questioning, and so they made a recount yesterday, and finally they gave the victory again to this left-wing candidate. They confirmed his victory, but there's still some doubt if this was something trustful or not. So they will continue to be like a left-wing government there. Yeah. In Mexico, our last GDP growth forecast was of 1.2% for this year, but actually now it's really difficult to make a forecast, growth forecast for Mexico. Yeah, I have seen many different forecasts from recession, break-even to GDP growth similar to the previous year of 2.3, but now we expect to decelerate somewhat. Okay. Peru, as I mentioned, now is still in 4, but we might review this downwards. Venezuela is even difficult to make a forecast because of the chaotic situation there. We don't have data available anymore. According to the IMF, inflation should reach 200% last year, so it's really a nightmare that we still can't see a light in the end of the tunnel there. Okay, so an increase of 1% in Latin America. So, as you may be familiar, we have our own country risk assessment. We review this on a quarterly basis. We have 8 different grades. We start with A1, A2, A3, and A4 are the investment grade countries. Then we have B, C, D, and E. E is it would be like off-cover country. Okay, in Latin America, the only one that from the major economies, the only E is Venezuela. Okay, so the last revision was in March this year. As you can see here and in the papers, we don't have any revision in Latin America this time, but we reviewed 2 ratings in January this year. We upgraded Argentina because of the adjustment that Mauricio Macri have been doing in the economy. Of course, there was a recession, but this was the side effect as he was dismantling all the artificial controls of the economy, the overvaluated exchange rate, the subsidies over public tariffs. Yeah, so measures that were really needed to be done. So now we expect improvements for this year. Mexico, we decided to downgrade to B. We saw some increasing risk there. There was also this strong volatility in exchange rate that we saw in the previous year. So now is as B. Brazil is as C. It was A3 until 2014. Then we downgraded many times because of the strong crisis there and political risk as well. Ecuador is also in C. Chile is the best one in the region with A3. Yeah, and we have Colombia and Peru as A4. Okay. So concerning the Trump risk in terms of trade channel, here we look at the first chart, the representativeness of each country, the major economies, to their exports to the United States. We break down in primary commodities and manufacturing, as we believe that the manufacturing is the main issue. That's the main worry of Trump, as he said that this was the main reason for the losing jobs in the U.S. manufacturing industry. So, considering the major economies, we say that Mexico is really reliant on commodities. Around 25% of GDP. The U.S. exports represent around 25% of GDP, and manufacturing alone represents 21%. Then we have like Ecuador with 10%, but basically of primary goods like oil, so it's not a big deal. But it's also important to take into account their trade deficit per country, and Mexico around $64 billion, so it's really high. Though for the other countries is a low deficit, and for Ecuador and Colombia, and with the other countries they have surplus of this country, so we don't see big risks in terms of trade channel, only with the exception of Mexico. From the financial side, with the strengthening of the US dollar and the risk, we analyze the risk of the external debt, which could impact this economy. So when we look to the external debt as a representativeness of GDP, and we break down in public and private debt, we see that Chile is the one with the highest ratio. It represents around 65% of their GDP. Then we have Colombia and Mexico with around 40% of GDP. Though we also need to take into account other factors. This figure alone doesn't mean anything. Like a very used index to evaluate this is when we look to the external debt as a percentage of exports. So then we see that the situation of Chile with 65% of their GDP is not that bad, because we see the case of Colombia, this represents 3.8 years of export. So it's the worst situation here, and that's because Colombia, as Brazil, are very closed economies. They need to be more open to trade. Though this is not the best moment, as we see the economies all around the world increasing their protectionism. So going to the Mexican economy, we see some mixed signals. The economy increased by 3.6 in 2015, slowed down just a little bit for 2.3 in the last year. And now when we look to the GDP proxy, the evolution of GDP proxy, the last available data that we have, that is from January, we still see activity in a good way, is still strong, increased 3% year over year. So it's not clear any downside risk to activity, and service continue to contribute to growth, to be the main driver of growth, while we have a lackluster industrial activity increasing by 0.1%. This lackluster activity is mainly because of oil production, which is going down very fast, continues for a decade, oil production is going down, and because of a slowdown in construction. Because of lower public resources, there's also a reduction in public investments. Though, on the other hand, while the activity is still strong, we see the confidence index is going down. The consumer and the manufacturing industries confidence indexes are going down. Actually, we saw in the last month some rebounding in the consumption one, though it's too early to say that this might reflect improvement, that this should be a long-lasting tendency. I don't believe that this could happen. Another point about that's why we expect to slow down too in the near future is because of the macro fundamentals. We see inflation picking up since the end of last year. First, we need to have into account the lagged effect of the volatility, the depreciation exchange rate observed in the last year. And secondly, what they call as gasolinazo. This is because they increase the gasoline prices because they used to have subsidies over the gasoline prices. And as this was not possible anymore because of the budget deficits, they started to increase in January this year, which highly impacted their inflation. So there was an increase of 17.1% in gasoline prices in March compared with the previous year. So now inflation is around 5.4%. And was around 2% in end 2015. So it was this big increase. So as they see inflation going up and all the threats related to the threat of Trump and the risk of the tightening monetary cycle in the US, they also started to increase interest rates. Interest rates was in 3% in the end of 2015, now in 6.5%. And they still expect more 2 moves this year in response to the Federal Reserve and to achieve 7% in the end of the year. In terms of remittances, this is a very important source of resources for the economy. It represents around 2.6% of the country's GDP. It's raised more money than the oil export, than foreign direct investments or the tourism there. 95% of this resource comes from the US. And actually we saw an interesting movement last year as there was these fears of the elections. People started started to send more money in advance to send before they was expecting to do it because they didn't know what's going to happen. So, and even after the election, it reached a peak in January this year of $27 billion US. Even with the threat, so there was some discussion that they could put a 2% tax over remittances. I don't expect to see a big movement, a big change, a big slowdown in this index, because if they decided to tax only the remittance that goes to the Mexican market, they will find a way to send to another country and then send back there. Or they can ask a friend to send to another person there. So that's why I don't see a lot of effectiveness of any measure to try to reduce this. Finally, in terms of total industrial production, as I mentioned, we see that this drop in oil production, and we still see that even with all the discussion, the worries about the manufacturing industry, the manufacturing industry has been contributing positively to the industrial activity. So in this first chart, we look the evolution of all this breakdown the industrial activity in comparison with in the January 2015. So we see that manufacturing industry is the one which has been performing better. In terms of employment rate in the manufacturing industries, the figures are still positive, very positive. While when we break down export, we also see export rebounding this year, and basically because of manufacturing goods. Our exports continue to go down because of years of underinvestment in Pemex. They opened the market for the oil industry in the end of 2013, but this was the worst moment because prices were going down. So it's difficult to attract investment. It was difficult to attract investment at that time. So we expect this to the oil segments to continue with a weak performance, while the manufacturing exports increased 6.5% in the first 3 months of this year compared to the previous year. So we still see the activity in the manufacturing industry doing well. So the breakdown of the trade relation of US and Mexico, we see that's really highly concentrated in two categories. Computers and electronics and transportation equipment represent around 50% of Mexico exports to the US. And so now moving to Brazil, we see the confidence indexes improving, rebounding, not only the business one that we mentioned before, but all the 5 that we have in the economy that measures the confidence there. They have a break-even point, which is 100 points, which separates pessimism with optimism. They are still pessimistic, though when we compare the level of the previous year to the level this year, they're all better than it was the previous year. But it's important to have in mind that this was not something linear. We see some ups and downs. In terms of GDP, the growth in a quarterly basis, still in the recession, the last data that we have, though we see that the weakest point was achieved in end 2015, early 2016. Now we are expecting a slight increase for the first quarter of this year to finally start to rebound. No? Then we see some better macro fundamentals. While in Mexico, inflation has been picking up. In Brazil, inflation now is going down very fast. It was in 10% in the last year. Now is close to the targets in 4.6% a year. So a big improvement. Interest rate in Brazil, which is historically very high. It was for over 1 year in 14.25%, started to decrease. Now it's in 11.25% and expected to end the year in 8%. But even with this strong reduction in exchange rate, when a company or a person goes to the bank and tries to get a loan, the reality is completely different because this is the benchmark interest rate. When you get to the bank, it's completely different. Interest rate is still high. Will need more time to go down. This is because they are still facing claims or high unpaid ratio. Yeah, and as I mentioned before, the trade balance is also helping. We had a record surplus there, and basically because of the increase in primary goods prices. Last year, the trade balance was improving, but basically because of stronger decrease in imports. Nowadays, this scenario is better. It's because of also an increase in exports. So we see the negative points in unemployment that's still going up, should continue to go up until the first half of this year to start to go down again. It's the last index to see the crisis, but then the last one also to recover there. There's a high bureaucracy to hire and to fire an employee there. So as the economy started to gradually recover, they will use the idle capacity that they have to then restart to hire again. And finally, for Brazil, we look to the number of Chapter 11 requests. As I mentioned, the interest rate is still high when in the final point, when we try to get to the bank. As the activity is still down, we see that there was a strong increase in Chapter 11 requests in the country in the last years. This year, in the last 3 months, it has improved somewhat. It has contracted, though it's still too early to say that this is a tendency that should change. But it's important to have in mind about insolvency in Brazil that differently what happens in the US, that a company stays for 2 years on the Chapter 11 protection, or they get bankrupt or they get back to the market. In Brazil, sometimes company gets over 8 years on the Chapter 11 protection with a long grace period, a big discount. So it's like a nightmare when a company gets to Chapter 11 request. Of course, this is something important to protect employment, to try to avoid bankruptcy, but they need to balance the rules. Finally, the last point is about Argentina. We're also expecting these improvements. When we look to the GDP proxy of the last one is from January as well, we see for the first time since March last year that increase on a year-on-year comparison. It was also increasing on a marginally basis. But the main point now is about inflation. Here, the first point that we have for inflation, the second chart, was November 2015, which was in 24%. This was not by coincidence that I started there. This is because it was the last month of the Kirchner government. So they left the government with inflation of 24%. This is actually the inflation of Buenos Aires, because at that time they could not trust in the official figures. So I continue to follow these ones. It achieved a peak of 47% the last year as they removed the artificial controls over exchange rate and the subsidies. Of course, this impacted over inflation. That's why we saw this pick up, but this, again, was necessary. But it's taken too long to slow down. So nowadays, it's around 35%. And this is something really important for the Macri government now, because this month was the first general strike over there, because a part of the population is unsatisfied with this reduction in purchasing power, and Macri doesn't have a majority in the Congress. They will have another legislative elections in late this year, so it's really important for him to get a good result in this legislative elections, so that he can get more support to continue his government and also to try re-election. And it's important to monitor, because we see with good eyes what's happening now, this change in Argentina, though we know that they have a strong, long history of crisis, of episodes of crisis. So if he fails to rebound the activity and to reduce inflation, we might have a change in power again to a populist government. Finally, our last slide shows our sector barometer that we produce and review on a quarterly basis. This is based on the payment experience of Coface, the economist indexes, and our claim experience. In Brazil, it seems bad when you look that everything is almost in red, but not that bad, because if I was showing this chart 3 months ago, they would be in black. So that after we saw some improvement in loss ratios and the perspective for the economy this year, we decided to reduce the risk assessments to improve the to upgrade. So we have only 2 segments that are still considered as a medium risk, which are pharmaceuticals and the cellulose segment. Pharmaceuticals, because population is aging, also because there's a lower elasticity, income elasticity, people who's not stopping to consume medicines because they are afraid of what's going to happen in the economy. And actually, when the economy is in recession, sometimes people consume more medicines. Yeah. And in the case of cellulose, because Brazil has a comparative advantage and is really highly associated with the export market. Okay. And in terms of Mexico, it's still in a better shape than Brazil. Though we decided to downgrade the automotive industry because of this strong link with the American economy, as well as we expecting the purchasing power of the Mexican population to reduce. So that's why we decided to downgrade. And the same thing happens to retail. Okay, so that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.